Hello everyone, my name's Al Thorliefson and I'm here representing the Pembina Manitoba Archive. We began working with the Cartwright community and the Badger Creek Museum a number of years ago through a partnership that we have with the Boundary Trail National Heritage Region. We're here today to take a look at some of the history of the museum in Cartwright and tell you a few of the stories. I'd like first of all to credit Art Thompson, one of the gentlemen from this community who really loved history. In 1974, he decided that the community needed a museum. And so he started working with the telephone system building in town, and that's where the first museum was started. In 1994, the building that we're currently in was built to house a lot of the community's collection. We have around us a lot of the sports memorabilia from the community. There are whole sections dealing with the fraternal organizations and also descriptions of different places in the community, different buildings. A lot of memories that are housed here represent a lot of very ardent people who really believed in their own history and the importance of it. In one section of the building, we have uniforms, jerseys, photographs of teams, books and articles that highlight the athletes of the community. In another, the community's fraternal organizations, the council members, clubs and committees, all are celebrated with photos, framed charters, and some of the banners of each of these organizations. One of the major displays in this museum, it involves one of Canada's earliest authors, Robert James Campbell Stead. Robert Stead came to this community in 1882 with his family, his four sisters, his mother Mary, and his father Richard. They settled on the northwest corner of Section 14, Township 1, Range 15. Now that's just 3 miles north of the American border. The family were there on the farm long enough for Stead to get his earliest education in Chesterville School, a small community school out on the bare open prairie. A lot of his biographers have been really surprised at how erudite a writer Stead was. And he, in his own time, even credited the education that he got in that very small country school, and then later in the pioneer school in Cartwright itself. Stead actually built a building on Main Street that would house his printing office. He also did other things, I guess maybe to supplement his income from the newspaper. So for example, there's one advertisement in the paper that says, "Flour and feed. When in need of anything in the above lines, give me a call. Robert J.C. Stead." So he was an entrepreneur. The Southern Manitoba Review was housed in the building at the far right in this picture. It was along North Railway Street in Cartwright. And this picture shows the scene before the bank building was actually built. By 1914, this picture shows the bank, and then beside it, Stead's news office. The home, which he shared at this point with his mother, was set back among the trees at the right-hand side of this image, again on North Railway Street. Stead came to be known as one of the prairie's best writers in that generation. Now, from our modern point of view, he was an imperialist, totally in favor of the British Empire, totally in favor of anything to do with the monarchy and Britain's role in Canada. But he was also a lover of the prairie. And so even in his earliest books, such as The Empire Builders, the book that he published while he still lived here in Cartwright, he talks about how profoundly the prairie affected him. I'm going to read directly from that book. This is from a poem called The Prairie. To those who have seen it and smelt it, to those who have loved it alone, to those who have known it and felt it, the prairie is ever their own. And far though they wander, unwary, far, far from the breadth of the plain, a thought of the wind on the prairie will set their blood rushing again. From the Empire Builders. In Stead's writing, in his poetry and in his novels, he doesn't just focus on the land itself. He focuses on the homesteaders, those folk who came from very different countryside in Europe and then also in Ontario, out to the prairie, a landscape that they really did not understand when they first arrived. He talks about the hard realities of life on the prairies, of how many children died while they were still very young, about how many women died in childbirth, and about how many men who just simply collapsed under the weight of trying to survive in prairie farming landscapes. The storms, the fires, the droughts, the insects, all these hazards influenced their lives, and Stead wrote about these things with an honest, open eye. Robert Stead celebrated education. He was very aware of the quality of his ability to write and also of his ability to speak. And when he was asked about the importance of education in his life, he said the following: "Education is not a thing of books or studies or formulas of any kind. It is the whole world of thought, feeling, and expression. It's not a flower in the garden of life, it's the garden itself. With its flowers, with its perfumes, and its sunshine, and its rain, yes, and its weeds, and droughts, and insects, and worms." When Stead decided that he wanted to go beyond Cartwright, he sold the newspaper. And for a while he worked with the CPR as a publicist, basically writing about the prairies, celebrating the prairies and the people of the prairies, and basically enticing people to come here to emigrate to the prairies and settle the prairies. Of course, the CPR saw these folk as potential passengers, and they'd need to bring all of their goods and their cattle on the CPR, so it was certainly in the CPR's best interest to promote immigration into Canada's prairies. And Stead's ability to write really did entice them. He was so good at it that the Canadian government asked him to join the Department of Immigration. And for many years, he actually worked for them, promoting immigration into the West and promoting just the settlement of different districts out here. As mentioned before, Stead was very much a British imperialist, and we see that in his early writing. But as a publicist for the Department of Immigration, he came to see the many different peoples of the world as important to Canada. He noted at one point that there was a lack of red and brown and yellow faces in Canada. And that, in his very understated way, noted that there was too much racism going on in the Department of Immigration. Having said that, though, he also noted, for example, the peoples who were coming west on the railroad. The first groups of people that he had noticed in his earlier years were the people who came here from Ontario, largely British, Irish, Scottish folk who had decided that the northwestern areas north of Toronto were not as good for farming as the prairies were. And so they came out to this area in the 1880s, the early 80s. But Stead, because he was also working with many other cultures as an immigration officer, he was also very aware of the importance of many other cultures to the growth of the prairies. He did note that there was a language barrier among many of these people, because of course you might have people from many different countries all on the same train, all going to the same destination in one district in western Manitoba or eastern Saskatchewan. He came to state his opinion on these people and the role they would play in a very interesting way, because he, as a writer, was very interested in Canadian literature. Here's what he said at one point. If Canada is to have a soul, if it is to be guided by that enduring process which distinguishes the permanent from the transient, it must have a literature. It may be English Canadian, French Canadian, Scandinavian Canadian, Slavic Canadian, any of the above. You see, Stead looked at people from all over the world coming to Canada, but becoming Canadians together. As one component of the Partnerships with Museums project that we established with the Boundary Trail National Heritage Region, we created this monograph. It celebrates the Badger Creek Museum, tells you a little bit about the exhibits in the building, and it also talks about the fact that there are a number of different museum buildings associated with it. So we're going to go through and describe some of those buildings to you and give you a little bit of their heritage as well. One of the buildings on site is the Mount Pleasant School District building. It was built in 1884, a one-room frame school building erected on the southwest quarter of 2213 West. Other than during a couple of periods of low enrollment in 1913 and 14, and again in 43-44, it served the community until consolidation in 1967. The stovepipe you'll notice in this photograph, it runs right through the middle of the schoolroom. And that was to ensure that as much radiant heat as possible was captured by the air in the room before the smoke entered the chimney. Each morning, cold water from the school's well would fill the brown water cooler, which sat prominently beside the school's honor roll, perhaps to remind the scholars of their goal while studying at the school. Todd's shoe repair shop, well, it's not a very imposing structure in and of itself, but it served the needs of the community for all types of leather repairs. In the 1960s, it was also a small but very favored gathering place for the community's young people. A line assembly, powered by an electric motor, carried burrs and sanders, which were used to shape the leather for use in the shoemaker's repairs. A wooden vise sat just to the side. And when customers entered the small shop, they found themselves in a small vestibule measuring less than 6 feet square. There they discussed their business with Mr. Todd through a window in the vestibule wall. The price listing is from the early 1960s. The Manitoba Telephone System building, which we noted earlier housed the very first museum in the community, was built in 1929 on the north side of Currie Street, at that point beside the Anglican Church, where the Reflection Park now stands. Since its move to the current museum site, The Manitoba Telephone System building has come to host several types of telephone exchange equipment, which were donated to the museum by different communities along the line. Mather had a post office from 1898. It was in the Fulford General Store, and in 1903 a small post office building was erected in the community. Its location moved several times, and then in the 1930s it moved to a building known as the John Moore Store. This building was destroyed by fire in September 1947. The post office building, which stands on the museum site, was first used following that fire. It was originally part of a house on the southeast quarter of 8113, and it was moved to Mather after the previous office burned. Inside that post office building, you can see the post boxes from both the postmaster's point of view and from the customer's point of view. By the late 1980s, the blacksmith shop, which had been built in town in 1888, had it had deteriorated. And a group of people in the community decided that it was time to do something to celebrate this integral part of any agricultural community. So a committee was formed, and they actually got rough lumber from northern Manitoba. It was milled, brought back to Cartwright, and brought to the site. The committee then deconstructed the original blacksmith shop, saved whatever lumber they could use, and rebuilt it exactly as it had been, using this poplar from northern Manitoba. Working with the last blacksmith in the community, Calvin Hill, the committee realized all the different components of the blacksmith shop that they really needed to include. So for example, the machinery was powered by a 3.5 horsepower IHC stationary engine, which stood in the back of the shop. A line shaft assembly, a series of drums along a single shaft from the engine, were connected by belts to each machine, sanders, grinders, a trip hammer, and the blower for the forge. All of these were run by the same line assembly. The collection in the blacksmith shop also includes many hand-powered carpentry tools, which would have been used to construct the first homes and businesses in the community. Christ Church Anglican Church in Cartwright is one of the sentinel buildings of the community. It was built by the mason Samuel Hossack and his sons Alex and Will in 1898. It's a modest example of English Gothic architecture and is one of the several fieldstone churches built in western Manitoba. Following a fire, the church was renovated in 1910 with the addition of a stone entry vestibule and upgraded interior spaces. Stained glass windows were also added to the chancel and to a window on the south wall. The church stands as the last unaltered stone building in Cartwright, and it acts as a focal point for the community's identity. However, over the years, the little stone church slipped into serious decline because of slippage in the stones and faced the prospect of demolition without extensive structural repairs to the foundation and exterior walls. In 2002, a committee was struck to seek historical designation for the church and plan its restoration. They received designation in 2003. The Restoration Committee secured information and reports from various experts in the field. With the help of these experts, a plan was developed to restore the building to its original state, carefully following the guidelines set out to preserve historical integrity. The team with experience in restoration was recruited, including a stonemason, construction workers, and a structural engineer. Geological soil sampling was done. The stained glass windows were removed, placed in special crates, and stored. All necessary building permits were secured, and then the building began. As each stone was removed from the walls, it was numbered and placed in a very specific place on the grounds beside the building. The foundations were dug down and replaced. The interior structure of the church was stabilized, and then the rebuilding began, one stone at a time, being placed exactly where it had been before. The church, when it was finished, is a tribute to a community's dedication to its faith and to its history.